What starts as an ordinary flight soon becomes an unforgettable journey, not just through the sky, but through the depths of character, courage, and redemption. In the calm hum of the business class cabin, passengers settle in for what they expect to be a routine trip. But when Barbara Wright, a successful yet prideful businesswoman, questions the presence of an elderly black woman in the seat beside her, tensions rise. What Barbara doesn't realize is that the woman she confronts, Margaret Ellis, is no ordinary passenger. As accusations fly and assumptions are laid bare, the atmosphere becomes thick with judgment, reflection, and revelation. But Margaret remains composed, answering hostility with quiet grace, planting seeds of growth not only in Barbara's heart, but in everyone watching. What happens next is more than a confrontation. It's a reckoning, a moment where pride and humility collide at 35,000 feet, leading to unexpected lessons in leadership, dignity, and the power of change. Will Barbara choose to rise above her mistakes, or will she remain trapped by the weight of her assumptions? And who exactly is Margaret Ellis, the woman whose calm presence commands the entire cabin? The business class cabin hummed with quiet, luxury leather seats, ambient lighting, and the soft rustle of newspapers. Passengers sipped their pre-flight drinks and settled into their seats, enjoying the calm before takeoff. Among them was Margaret Ellis, an older black woman dressed in an elegant navy blue suit. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and a string of pearls adorned her neck. She radiated quiet confidence as she flipped through the pages of her well-worn journal. Margaret had boarded early and settled by the window, enjoying the view of the bustling airport below. Just as she took a sip of her tea, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me," the voice demanded. "There must be some mistake." Margaret looked up calmly to see a middle-aged woman with auburn hair and an air of entitlement standing beside her seat. Barbara Wright wore a tailored blazer and carried an expensive leather tote, but her expression was marred by disdain. "This can't be right," Barbara muttered, gesturing at Margaret. "How is she sitting here?" Margaret gave a polite smile. "Is there a problem?" Barbara folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, there is. This is business class. I don't know how you got this seat, but—" Before she could finish, a flight attendant arrived. "Is there something I can assist with?" she asked, her professional demeanor intact despite the tension. Barbara pointed to Margaret. "I want to know how someone like her got this seat." The flight attendant's face tensed. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Margaret handed it over calmly. After a quick glance, the attendant returned it with a respectful nod. "Everything is in order. This is her assigned seat." Barbara's mouth tightened in disbelief. That can't be right. A murmur spread among the passengers. A man across the aisle leaned over and muttered, "Unbelievable." Margaret remained seated, her calm unshaken. She met Barbara's glare with quiet strength. "This isn't about the seat," Margaret said, her voice steady. "It's about the assumptions you've made." Barbara blinked, thrown off by the unexpected response. "And who exactly are you?" Margaret smiled faintly. "You'll find out soon enough." The flight attendant exchanged uneasy glances with her colleague, knowing the situation was escalating. The murmurs grew louder as passengers discreetly recorded the exchange. But just when the scene seemed on the verge of boiling over, the cabin door opened again, and an older man in a sharp suit stepped inside. His name was Henry Caldwell, the flight supervisor. With a calm yet authoritative air, he approached. "Is there an issue here?" Barbara wasted no time. "Yes, this woman is in the wrong seat." Henry's eyes softened when they landed on Margaret. To Barbara's surprise, he bowed slightly. "Mrs. Ellis, it's an honor to see you again." The murmurs in the cabin halted. Barbara's face paled. Mrs. Ellis was one of the foremost advisors for international aviation policies, Henry explained. "She's dedicated her life to shaping the very standards we uphold today." Barbara's disbelief deepened. "She... what?" Margaret finally closed her journal and looked directly at Barbara. "We all come from stories you can't see at first glance," she said gently. "But you've made yours clear from the moment you spoke." Barbara's confidence faltered, but before she could speak again, the flight attendant interrupted. "We need to prepare for takeoff." The tension simmered, but Margaret's poise had already shifted the air in the cabin. As Margaret returned to her journal, a young man in the back of the cabin spoke up. "Wait, you're Dr. Ellis." He stood, his face a mixture of awe and pride. "You're the reason I became an aeronautical engineer." Barbara's gaze darted nervously between the passengers and the attendants. The weight of her assumptions pressed heavier with each revelation. But this was only the beginning. As the plane ascended into the clouds, the cabin settled into an uneasy silence. The hum of the engines filled the space, but beneath the surface, tension lingered like a low current. Margaret Ellis sat back in her seat, adjusting her reading glasses, as though the previous scene had been nothing more than a fleeting breeze. Barbara Wright, however, couldn't let it go. She sat rigidly in her seat, eyes fixed ahead, but her thoughts churned. The young engineer's revelation about Margaret's legacy echoed in her mind. She couldn't believe that the woman she had dismissed so quickly was someone important enough to command admiration from both passengers and crew. Unable to contain herself, Barbara leaned toward the aisle and whispered to the flight attendant who passed by, "I don't understand. Who exactly is she?" The attendant hesitated, her expression both wary and respectful. Mrs. Ellis was once the director of aviation safety for the International Civil Aviation Organization. She revolutionized global safety standards. Most of us in this industry owe her our jobs. Barbara's breath caught in her throat. She turned back toward Margaret, who was quietly scribbling notes in the margins of her journal. A flicker of doubt bloomed in Barbara's chest, but it quickly gave way to defensiveness. "It doesn't change anything," Barbara muttered under her breath. "I'm not wrong for questioning things." Her murmurs, though soft, didn't escape Margaret's sharp ears. The older woman closed her journal gently and looked at Barbara. "You remind me of someone," Margaret said, her voice calm but resolute. Barbara looked at her, startled. "Excuse me?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "A woman I met many years ago. She also thought she was always right. She assumed her way of seeing the world was the only way that mattered." Barbara bristled. "And what happened to her?" Margaret's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "She learned a lesson that changed her life. But it didn't come easily." Barbara crossed her arms. "Well, I'm not here for a lecture." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes life gives us lessons whether we're ready for them or not." Before Barbara could respond, another voice cut through the tension, a calm, low voice that carried authority. "We're all students in the school of humility at some point, aren't we?" Both women turned toward the source of the voice. Standing in the aisle was an older man in a crisp navy blue uniform, Captain Leonard Reese, the pilot of the flight. His sharp eyes glanced between Barbara and Margaret before resting gently on Margaret. "Dr. Ellis," he greeted with a nod of deep respect. "It's been a long time." Margaret smiled warmly. "Indeed it has, Captain Reese. I didn't expect to see you here." The captain chuckled. "I didn't expect to see you either. The last time we spoke, you told me to never underestimate the power of quiet leadership." Barbara's eyes widened. "Wait, you know each other?" Captain Reese nodded. "Mrs. Ellis was the lead investigator during a critical inquiry that changed aviation safety forever. I was a young co-pilot on that flight. I owe her my career." Barbara blinked, trying to process everything. The story felt like something out of a movie, impossible, surreal. "You're saying she saved lives?" "She did," Reese said, "and she did it with more grace and strength than I've ever seen." The cabin grew quieter as passengers who had been half listening now leaned in, captivated by the unfolding history. Even those scrolling through their phones paused. Curiosity piqued. Barbara's throat felt dry. She wanted to refute it, to hold on to her righteous indignation, but the weight of the truth pressed down on her. "Why," she began, faltering for the first time, "why didn't you say anything earlier?" Margaret's eyes softened. "Because I don't believe in using titles to force respect. People should be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they sit." Barbara felt a knot tighten in her chest. The simplicity of those words pierced through her defenses. Captain Reese gave Barbara a long, measured look before speaking again. "Mrs. Wright, would you be willing to listen for a moment?" Barbara hesitated, but nodded stiffly. Reese motioned toward Margaret. "The reason she's here today is no coincidence. This flight is headed to a major aviation conference in New York, a conference honoring pioneers who've shaped this industry." A ripple of recognition spread through the cabin as murmurs returned. Barbara felt the stares from other passengers. Embarrassment and guilt warred within her. She swallowed hard. "I didn't know?" Margaret leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but firm. "That's the problem, isn't it? Assumptions blind us. They make us think we know more than we do." Barbara's eyes filled with something close to regret. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, another revelation was waiting, one that would change the course of the conversation. A teenage boy near the back of the cabin stood up suddenly. His voice shook, but his words carried conviction. "She's the reason my family is alive." Everyone turned in surprise. The boy's face was earnest as he clutched a faded photo. "My dad was on that flight she saved years ago. I grew up hearing about the woman who stayed calm while others panicked." Barbara stared at the boy, then at Margaret. The air felt heavier now, filled with unspoken truths and the lingering weight of unacknowledged stories. Margaret's eyes softened. "Your father was brave that day too," she said kindly. The boy nodded. "But it was you who gave him hope." Barbara sank further into her seat, stunned into silence. For the first time, her world felt less certain, her convictions less secure. Margaret turned to the flight attendant and Captain Reese. "It's time we continue our journey," she said calmly. Reese nodded. "Of course." As the captain returned to the cockpit and the attendants resumed their duties, the plane seemed to exhale with them. But Barbara sat motionless, the echoes of every story weighing down on her. Margaret leaned in one last time, her voice quiet. "We all have a choice in moments like these to cling to our pride or to let humility teach us something." Barbara didn't answer, but the way she lowered her gaze spoke volumes. The flight had only just begun, but the lessons learned at 35,000 feet would last a lifetime. Barbara Wright sat frozen in her seat, her mind swirling with fragments of everything she had just heard. The quiet hum of the plane felt deafening as the revelations settled over her like a heavy blanket. Margaret Ellis, the same woman she had insulted, was a legend in aviation, a pioneer who had saved lives, shaped policies, and inspired countless people. Barbara had spent her life priding herself on being discerning and vigilant. But now, she felt exposed, stripped of the certainty she always carried. The stories shared by the passengers and the reverence in Captain Reese's voice played over and over in her mind. Margaret, however, seemed perfectly at peace. She had resumed her reading, the faint sound of a pencil scratching as she jotted notes in the margin. Barbara's gaze drifted back toward the elderly woman. How could someone endure so much scrutiny, achieve so much, and yet remain so composed? Finally, Barbara's pride cracked just enough for curiosity to slip through. She took a deep breath, leaned forward slightly, and spoke in a quiet voice. "Mrs. Ellis," she began, unsure of how to continue. I don't understand. How did you become you?" Margaret didn't look surprised. She closed her book slowly, placed it on her lap, and turned toward Barbara with a measured gaze. "I didn't wake up one day as the person you see now," Margaret said, her voice calm but resonant. It was a long journey, paved with hard lessons, sacrifices, and moments just like this when I was forced to confront things I thought I knew. Barbara's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Margaret rested her hands on the cover of her journal. You assume you know people because of what you see. I made that same mistake once. Barbara blinked, surprised. You did? Margaret nodded. When I was young, I was ambitious, determined to prove myself in a world that wasn't always welcoming. But my ambition blinded me. I assumed that anyone who doubted me was my enemy. Her eyes softened. Then I met someone who changed everything. Barbara leaned in despite herself. Who? Margaret smiled, a distant look in her eyes. Her name was Grace Parker. She was an older black woman who became my mentor when I was struggling to make my way in the aviation industry. I thought she would teach me technical strategies or how to be tough, but instead, she taught me about dignity and patience. Barbara listened, her defensiveness slowly unraveling. Grace told me something I've never forgotten, Margaret continued. She said, Margaret, the loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest. True strength is in how you choose to respond, even when the world expects you to lose control. Barbara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Margaret's words rang painfully true. But what if people never see you for who you really are? Barbara asked, her voice wavering. What if you're constantly underestimated? Margaret's expression softened further. That happens more often than you think. But you don't have to carry the weight of their assumptions. You only have to carry yourself with grace. Barbara lowered her eyes. I don't think I know how to do that. Margaret gave a small, understanding nod. It takes practice and humility. At that moment, the boy who had spoken earlier, the one whose father had been saved on that fateful flight, walked down the aisle, stopping near Margaret's seat. He held out the photo he had been clutching earlier. Mrs. Ellis, he said softly, this is my dad. Margaret took the photo gently and studied it. It was a snapshot of a man in his 40s, smiling with his arm around his son. There was something unmistakably kind in his face. Margaret's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. He looks happy. The boy nodded. He is. He always tells me that you're the reason he got to see me grow up. Barbara watched the exchange, a lump forming in her throat. This wasn't just about seats, rules, or appearances. It was about humanity, about stories untold and kindness remembered. Margaret handed the photo back and patted the boy's hand. Your father was brave, and so are you. The boy beamed, then returned to his seat. The cabin fell silent again, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a quiet reverence in the air, an acknowledgement of the legacy Margaret carried with her. Barbara shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mrs. Ellis, She started, but her words faltered. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. Margaret waited patiently, giving her the space to find her voice. I've spent my whole life thinking that being right was the most important thing, Barbara admitted. But I think I've been wrong about a lot. Margaret's eyes shone with understanding. Admitting that is the first step. The next step is asking yourself what kind of person you want to be moving forward. Barbara took a shaky breath. I don't know if I can undo the damage I've done. Margaret smiled gently. You can't change the past, but you can decide what you'll do in the present. That's where real change begins. Barbara fell silent, absorbing Margaret's words. In that moment, she felt something shift within her, a quiet but profound realization that the path to becoming a better person started with listening, not speaking. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the flight attendants resumed their duties. Margaret picked up her journal again but glanced at Barbara before she did. One more thing, Margaret said. The next time you feel the need to judge someone, remember this. You're looking at one chapter of their story, not the whole book. Barbara nodded slowly, her throat too tight to speak. Margaret returned to her notes, but Barbara stayed still, replaying every moment of the encounter in her mind. She didn't know what the rest of the flight would bring, but one thing was certain: she would never forget the lessons learned from Margaret Ellis. Barbara Wright sat quietly as the plane hummed steadily at cruising altitude, her mind racing with everything Margaret Ellis had said. She looked around the cabin and noticed how many passengers still stole glances at Margaret, not with pity or discomfort, but with admiration. It was as if her presence had reshaped the atmosphere. Barbara shifted in her seat and glanced back at Margaret, who was calmly jotting something in her journal again, her elegant hands steady despite the emotional turbulence they'd just passed through. Barbara took a deep breath, her pride warring with the strange vulnerability rising within her. She had always viewed humility as weakness, but Margaret's poise had shown her otherwise. It wasn't weakness, it was a kind of strength she'd never understood before. "May I ask you something?" Barbara's voice was hesitant, almost unsure. Margaret looked up, a soft, patient smile on her face. "Of course," Barbara swallowed. "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong, even when you knew you'd earned your place?" Margaret's eyes softened. "More times than I can count," she admitted. "When I became one of the first black women to lead an aviation task force, I was questioned at every turn. My decisions, my intelligence, sometimes even the way I spoke, were scrutinized. But Grace Parker, my mentor, told me something I never forgot." Barbara leaned in slightly. Her curiosity piqued. Margaret continued, her voice steady. She said, "You don't need anyone's permission to take up space where you belong. You've earned your seat at the table, so sit with your head high." Barbara nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "That sounds easier said than done." Margaret chuckled, a sound that felt warm and reassuring. "It wasn't easy, but I learned that sitting at that table wasn't just about me. It was about making sure that when the next person came along, someone who looked like me or shared my struggles, they wouldn't have to fight quite as hard." Barbara's gaze drifted toward the window, lost in thought. For so long, she had viewed the world through a lens of entitlement, convinced that she'd earned her place in life by following the rules and demanding respect. But Margaret's story made her realize how narrow her view had been. A few seats away, the teenage boy who had shown Margaret the photo of his father whispered something to his mother, who nodded with a warm smile. The boy looked back at Margaret with awe, as though seeing her as more than a person, as a living reminder of resilience and hope. Barbara watched the boy and felt something stir deep within her, a pang of regret that quickly bloomed into something more profound: the need to change. "Mrs. Ellis," Barbara hesitated, then pushed forward. "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier. I was wrong." Margaret studied Barbara for a long moment, her expression kind but unwavering. "Apologies matter," Margaret said softly, "but they're only the first step." Barbara nodded. "I know. I've got a lot to unlearn." Margaret's eyes held a quiet wisdom. "That's true for all of us. The important thing is to start." Barbara was about to respond when a small commotion in the aisle caught her attention. A middle-aged man in a navy suit had stood up, clearing his throat to speak. He turned to face the cabin, his voice carrying with quiet conviction. "I feel like I need to say something," the man began. "My name is Daniel Shaw. I grew up in a small town where people weren't always kind to anyone who was different. I used to think the way Barbara did today." Barbara stiffened at the mention of her name, but stayed quiet, listening. Daniel's eyes shifted toward Margaret. "But then I moved to Chicago, got a job in aviation, and met someone who challenged everything I thought I knew. Someone who made me realize that judging people based on assumptions says more about you than it does about them." He gestured toward Margaret. "That person was you, Mrs. Ellis." A quiet ripple of recognition spread through the cabin. Margaret gave him a thoughtful nod. I remember you, Daniel. Daniel smiled, though his eyes glistened with emotion. You changed my life, and seeing you handle everything today with such grace, I just wanted to thank you again. Margaret's smile deepened. You didn't have to thank me then, and you don't have to thank me now. But I'm glad you're here. Barbara felt as though the floor beneath her was shifting. She was watching, in real time, the echoes of one woman's legacy spreading through the lives of others. It was humbling and overwhelming. Daniel returned to his seat, and the flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking in with passengers. She paused by Margaret's seat, her expression filled with admiration. Is there anything I can get you, Mrs. Ellis? Margaret shook her head kindly. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. The attendant smiled and moved on. Barbara watched the interaction, her chest tight with the weight of her thoughts. Margaret glanced at Barbara and spoke in a quiet tone. You've been given an opportunity, Barbara, a chance to be better than you were this morning. Barbara nodded slowly. I don't know if I deserve it. Margaret's eyes twinkled. Deserving it isn't the point. The question is, what will you do with it? Barbara fell silent, her mind racing as she tried to grasp the enormity of that question. The plane's intercom chimed, and the captain's voice came through, calm and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and the rest of the flight should be smooth. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey. Barbara heard the words, but her focus remained on Margaret's. She wasn't sure where her personal journey would take her next, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to listen, to learn, and to grow. Barbara sat in silence, staring down at her folded hands as the hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin. Margaret's words replayed in her mind over and over. What will you do with it? The weight of that question felt like a spotlight on her soul, exposing every assumption she had ever made. She had spent her whole life convinced that she was the type of person who stood for fairness, who fought for what was right. But now she was beginning to see that her version of fairness had been distorted by privilege and narrow thinking. Margaret Ellis wasn't just another passenger. She was a living testament to resilience and wisdom, a woman who had earned her place in history and changed countless lives, including, it seemed, several people on this very flight. Barbara took a shaky breath and glanced out the window. The vast expanse of clouds below looked endless, a reminder of how small they all were up here. But that smallness didn't feel scary. It felt humbling. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of whispers from the back of the cabin. She turned and saw two passengers, a young woman with curly hair and a man in his 40s, speaking with animated expressions. Barbara frowned slightly. She wasn't in the mood for more distractions. But then she noticed the young woman step forward and clear her throat nervously. "Excuse me," she said, her voice timid yet sincere. "Mrs. Ellis?" Margaret looked up from her journal, her gaze warm and inviting. "Yes, dear?" The young woman smiled nervously and gestured toward the man behind her. "My name's Rachel, and this is my Uncle James. We wanted to say something, if that's okay." Margaret nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Of course." Rachel took a step closer, and the entire cabin seemed to lean in to listen. "My uncle was a flight mechanic for almost 20 years. He's always talked about how much safer things became because of the policies you fought for." Her voice trembled slightly. "He says you saved more lives than you'll ever know." James stepped forward, his voice rough but sincere. "I never thought I'd get the chance to thank you in person," he said, "but seeing how you handled all of this today, I get it now. You're not just smart, you're strong in a way that most people don't know how to be." Margaret's smile was soft, but her eyes glistened. "Thank you. Your words mean more than you know." Rachel hesitated, then added, "When you spoke earlier about making space for others, It reminded me of something my grandmother used to say. She told me, "Sometimes you're called to clear the path so the next generation doesn't have to." I think you've cleared more paths than most people realize. The cabin was quiet again, filled with a reverent stillness. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Your grandmother was a wise woman. Barbara watched the exchange, her chest tightening. The stories kept coming, like waves crashing against the shore of her assumptions. She had boarded this flight convinced that she understood the world, but now she felt like she was standing in the middle of a vast ocean she'd never noticed before. She suddenly felt compelled to speak. "Rachel," Barbara said, her voice soft but clear. "Your grandmother's words. They're powerful." Rachel turned toward Barbara, surprised but intrigued. "Yeah," Rachel replied, her tone cautious but kind. Barbara exhaled slowly. "I never thought much about what it means to clear a path for someone else. I guess I've always walked paths that were already paved for me." Rachel's expression softened, and James nodded knowingly. "Most people don't see the work behind the road until they trip over the cracks." Barbara's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Yeah, I think I've been tripping for a long time." Margaret watched Barbara with quiet approval, sensing the shift in her. James cleared his throat, breaking the somber mood. "Well, I'm not much for speeches, but thanks again, Mrs. Ellis, for everything." Margaret inclined her head. "Thank you. And thank you for the work you've done behind the scenes. People often forget how important that work is." James smiled, and he and Rachel returned to their seats. Barbara felt the conversation's weight settle over her, like a heavy coat. She turned back to Margaret. "I've spent my whole life telling myself I'm a good person, but today I don't feel like one." Margaret leaned in, her expression gentle but serious. "Being good isn't about how you feel in a single moment. It's about what you choose to do over and over again." Barbara's throat tightened. "How did you do it? How did you stay calm when people doubted you, insulted you?" Margaret's eyes darkened with memory, but she spoke evenly. "I wasn't always calm. I've been angry, hurt. But I learned that if I let those emotions control me, I'd be giving my power away. And I didn't fight this hard, this long, just to let ignorance win." Barbara nodded slowly, understanding now why Margaret's quiet strength felt more powerful than any argument or outburst. Margaret leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes briefly, as if resting. Barbara let the silence stretch, letting it fill the cracks in her understanding. After a moment, Barbara whispered, almost to herself, "I think I've been holding on to my pride for so long that I forgot what humility looks like." Margaret opened her eyes and gave a small, approving nod. "Then you're already on the right path." The plane continued its steady course across the sky, but for Barbara, it felt as though she'd stepped onto entirely new ground. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't clinging to her assumptions or defensiveness. She was listening. The plane soared steadily above the clouds, but inside, the air was charged with reflection. The hum of the engines blended into the soft rustling of magazines, quiet conversations, and the occasional clink of glasses from the flight attendants serving drinks. Barbara Wright sat quietly, replaying every conversation that had happened since takeoff. The weight of her actions still pressed heavily on her chest, but for the first time, it wasn't guilt holding her down, it was realization. Margaret Ellis, sitting calmly beside her, radiated an unshakable sense of peace. Barbara envied that strength, but also admired it. She had never felt so small yet so desperate to grow. Barbara broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "Mrs. Ellis, have you ever wanted to just give up? Walk away from everything?" Margaret glanced at Barbara, considering the question. "Many times," she admitted. "There were moments when I wanted to leave the fight behind, when I was tired of being the one who had to prove herself again and again. But then I'd remember something Grace Parker told me." Barbara leaned in. "What was that?" Margaret smiled softly, her eyes distant as though seeing the past unfold. She said, "If you leave the table because it's unfair, someone else will take your seat, and they may not use it for good." Barbara absorbed the words like a sponge. She had walked away from uncomfortable moments so many times in her life. She'd told herself it wasn't her job to fix things that made her uneasy. But Margaret's life had been built on the very idea of staying, even when the table wasn't welcoming. Barbara swallowed the knot in her throat. "I've always thought that fairness meant rules, standards, but maybe I've only ever used those words when it suited me." Margaret's gaze was steady. Fairness isn't always about the rules. It's about how those rules are applied and who gets left out when they're made. Barbara stared down at her hands. "I think I've been so scared of being wrong that I've never really listened." Margaret's lips curved gently. "Most of us have been there, but you're listening now." Barbara's eyes lifted, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she felt something other than shame. She felt possibility. Suddenly, the calm of the cabin was interrupted by a familiar, authoritative voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Barbara glanced up as Captain Reese's voice filled the cabin. "We're currently making excellent progress toward New York, and the weather looks clear ahead. But I wanted to take a moment to share something with all of you." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, curious. The passengers around her stopped their conversations, tuning in. "As many of you witnessed, today's flight has been unique," Captain Reese continued. "And I believe it's important to acknowledge what we've learned during this journey." Barbara felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure where this was going, but something told her it wasn't just a typical captain's announcement. "I've been flying for over 30 years, Reese said, his voice steady. "But the most important lessons I've learned haven't come from manuals or cockpit checklists. They've come from people. And today, we were reminded that every person who sits in one of these seats carries a story. Some stories are visible, but most are not." The cabin was silent, every ear tuned to the captain's words. "This flight has taught me, and I hope all of us, something valuable. Dignity isn't something you earn by status or title. It's something you grant, no matter who you're speaking to or what you think you know about them." Barbara's breath caught in her throat. She felt the words land in her chest like a stone, reverberating with truth. "And finally," Reese concluded, "I want to recognize someone who has not only shaped this industry, but reminded us today what leadership looks like. Dr. Margaret Ellis, thank you for your legacy, your wisdom, and for reminding us to listen." A ripple of applause began in the back of the cabin and spread quickly, building into something powerful and sincere. The clapping grew louder as passengers turned to Margaret, their faces full of admiration. Barbara hesitated, but then, with trembling hands, she began clapping too. This wasn't just for Margaret. It was a recognition of the lesson they had all witnessed at 35,000 feet. Margaret's face remained composed, though her eyes shimmered with gratitude. She nodded politely to the passengers, acknowledging the applause with quiet humility. Barbara lowered her hands as the applause faded. "That was—" She shook her head, searching for words. "I've never seen anything like this." Margaret smiled softly. "It's not about the applause, it's about the change it represents." Barbara nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle deep in her bones. "I don't want this to be just a moment I forget when I get off the plane," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to be better." Margaret reached out and patted Barbara's hand gently. "Then start by asking yourself one simple question. What kind of person do you want to be when the world tests you again?" Barbara exhaled slowly, realizing the answer would take time, but she was ready to find it. As the plane continued its journey toward New York, the tension that had once filled the cabin dissipated. Conversations resumed, but this time they were softer, more reflective. Passengers who had been strangers hours ago exchanged stories and smiles. Barbara glanced at Margaret again. The older woman had returned to her journal, writing with quiet purpose. For the first time in her life, Barbara didn't feel the need to fill the silence with noise or defensiveness. She simply sat still and listened to the world, to others, and to herself. The New York skyline shimmered in the distance as the plane began its gradual descent. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, packed away their belongings, and exchanged polite nods with the flight attendants. Yet despite the familiar hum of pre-landing routine, something felt different. The air was still heavy with reflection, like the cabin itself had absorbed the lessons learned mid-flight. Barbara Wright stared out the window, watching the vast expanse of city come into view. She had made this trip dozens of times before, but this time felt profoundly different. The person she was when she boarded the plane wasn't the same person who would step off it. Margaret Ellis, seated beside her, had quietly closed her journal and tucked it into her bag. She noticed Barbara's faraway look and smiled softly. Lost in thought? Barbara nodded slowly, as if the weight of her thoughts kept her tethered. It's a lot, she admitted. Margaret's gaze was kind, but discerning. It should be. If change feels easy, it usually isn't real. Barbara sighed and turned toward Margaret. I keep wondering, what happens next? Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Next, you choose. You choose who you want to be. When you walk off this plane, you carry everything you've learned or you leave it behind. Barbara swallowed hard. And if I mess up? Margaret's eyes twinkled with quiet wisdom. You will. We all do. But humility isn't about being perfect, it's about being willing to grow. Barbara nodded, comforted by the honesty of those words. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've begun our final descent into New York City. Please ensure your seat backs and tray tables are in their upright positions as we prepare for landing. Thank you for flying with us. The announcement prompted a flurry of movement in the cabin as passengers followed the familiar pre-landing instructions. The teenage boy who had spoken earlier was craning his neck toward the window, excited to see the view. Across the aisle, the man in the Navy suit, Daniel Shaw, glanced at Barbara and offered a small, encouraging smile. She nodded back, feeling a surprising sense of connection to people who had been strangers only hours ago. Margaret leaned back, resting her head against the seat. Do you know what I remember most from my first major flight? She asked, her voice thoughtful. Barbara tilted her head, intrigued. What? Margaret's eyes drifted upward, as if she could see the memory playing out. It was a transatlantic flight to Paris. I was nervous but determined. I'd fought tooth and nail to be at that conference table. But when the plane landed, I realized that the real work wasn't in the recognition, it was in what I did after I got off that plane. Barbara absorbed Margaret's words like a blueprint for her next steps. And what did you do? Margaret's lips curved into a knowing smile. I spoke up, even when my voice shook. I made room for others at the table, even when I wasn't sure there was enough space for me. Barbara's breath caught in her throat. She thought of all the times she had demanded space for herself without considering whether she was taking it away from someone else. The realization stung, but it was necessary. The plane descended lower, the buildings of New York City now visible in sharp detail. Barbara could see the bridges, the streets packed with cars, the endless movement of life below. She felt small again, but this time, the smallness didn't make her feel insignificant. It made her feel part of something bigger. Mrs. Ellis, Barbara said, her voice more confident now. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I want to try. Margaret reached over and gently squeezed Barbara's hand. That's all anyone can ask. As the plane touched down with a soft thud and began to taxi toward the gate, the cabin was filled with the familiar chorus of unbuckling seatbelts and passengers reaching for their luggage. The flight attendants moved efficiently, offering final instructions with practiced ease. Barbara took one last look around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the faces of the people she'd shared this unexpected journey with: Rachel, James, Daniel, and the teenage boy, who still clutched the photo of his father. These strangers had taught her something she would carry for the rest of her life. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began to stand and gather their things. Barbara remained seated for a moment longer, watching as Margaret calmly reached for her bag. "Mrs. Ellis," Barbara said softly. Margaret looked up, her expression patient and warm. "Thank you," Barbara said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For everything." Margaret smiled a smile that carried years of wisdom and grace. "Thank yourself, Barbara. You're the one who chose to listen." Barbara felt the truth of those words settle into her heart. She stood and gathered her bag, ready to disembark not just from the plane, but from the person she had been. As the passengers filed out, many of them nodded to Margaret or murmured quiet words of thanks. Captain Reese stood near the exit, greeting each person as they passed. When Margaret reached him, he extended his hand with a broad smile. "It's been an honor, Dr. Ellis," he said sincerely. Margaret shook his hand warmly. "The honor is mine, Captain. Thank you for your words today." Barbara followed closely behind, her heart still heavy with both regret and hope. When she passed Captain Reese, he met her gaze with a nod, not of pity, but of encouragement. Outside the gate, the terminal buzzed with the familiar sounds of arrivals, families reuniting, announcements echoing overhead, and travelers rushing to their next destination. But Barbara didn't rush. She slowed her steps, letting everything settle. Margaret turned to her one last time before they parted ways. "Remember, Barbara, it's not where you start, or even where you stumble. It's what you do after you rise." Barbara's eyes shimmered as she smiled. "I'll remember." Margaret nodded and walked toward the exit, her frame small but her presence vast. Barbara stood for a moment, watching her go. She pulled out her phone and opened a blank email draft. The subject line read, "A commitment to change." As her fingers hovered over the keyboard, Barbara thought of every choice she had ever made and every step she would take moving forward. She wasn't sure what her next chapter would look like, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to write it. Barbara Wright walked slowly through the bustling terminal, the sound of rolling luggage wheels and flight announcements blending into white noise. Travelers passed by in waves, families, business people, backpackers, but Barbara barely noticed them. Her mind was still back on the plane, replaying the lessons she'd learned and the words Margaret Ellis had left behind. She reached a row of empty chairs by a large window overlooking the runway and sank into one. Planes taxied and took off in the distance, heading toward destinations unknown. Barbara watched them, feeling the gravity of her own journey, though her feet were planted on solid ground. She pulled out her phone again and stared at the email draft she'd begun moments ago. The words, "A commitment to change," stared back at her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't know exactly what to say. What kind of commitment did she owe herself and others? Just as Barbara was about to put the phone away, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "You're still here?" Barbara turned and was surprised to see Daniel Shaw, the man in the Navy suit who had shared his story during the flight, standing nearby. He held a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. She gave him a small smile and nodded. "I needed a minute." Daniel set his briefcase down and took a seat next to her. "Yeah, me too," he said, exhaling as he leaned back. "That wasn't just another flight, was it?" Barbara shook her head. "No, it wasn't." She hesitated before adding, "I didn't expect it to change everything." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the runway. "Neither did I. But sometimes life catches you off guard." He paused before glancing sideways at her. "You know, it took me years to admit I was wrong about how I used to see people." I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down, it was fear. Fear of what I didn't understand. Barbara felt the truth of his words resonate within her. I think that's what it was for me too, she admitted quietly. I was afraid to question my own beliefs, because what if I realized I'd been wrong all along? Daniel gave her an encouraging nod. It's hard to admit, but it's brave to face it head on. He took a sip of his coffee, then chuckled softly. Margaret Ellis. I've never met anyone like her. Barbara smiled. Neither have I. There was a pause, the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. They both sat there, reflecting on the extraordinary woman who had changed their lives in a matter of hours. After a moment, Daniel shifted in his seat. You know, when I told my story on that flight, I didn't think anyone would care. But it felt right. Like I was supposed to speak up, no matter how small it seemed. Barbara nodded, thoughtful. I've spent so long believing that speaking up was only necessary when it benefited me. But now I see that sometimes staying silent can do just as much harm. Daniel's gaze softened. Sounds like you've already started changing. Barbara tilted her head, considering his words. Maybe, but I think change doesn't mean much if you don't put it into action. Daniel raised his coffee cup in an impromptu toast. Here's to action, then. Barbara smiled and clinked her water bottle against his cup. To action. Just then, Barbara's phone buzzed with a new notification. Her heart sank slightly when she saw the headline. Viral video. Airline CEO confronts prejudice with grace at 35,000 feet. The thumbnail showed Margaret's calm face mid-sentence, and Barbara's own stunned expression in the background. The sight of herself rigid, accusatory, felt like a punch to the gut. Daniel noticed her expression and leaned over to glance at the screen. Ah, it's already online. Barbara set the phone down on her lap, her stomach twisting. It's worse than I thought, she murmured. Daniel's tone was gentle but firm. People are going to have opinions, good and bad. But what matters is what you do next. Barbara nodded slowly. Margaret said the same thing. Daniel grinned. She's smart like that. Barbara stared at the phone for another long moment before she reopened her email draft. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then began to type. Dear Dr. Ellis, I don't expect you to respond to this, but I wanted to say thank you. Not just for your patience and grace during that flight, but for holding up a mirror I didn't know I needed. I've spent my life thinking I understood fairness, but I see now that I've only understood my own version of it, one that served me, not others. I want to be better. I know words aren't enough, so I'm promising myself that this change will be seen in my actions, not just my apologies. Thank you for showing me what dignity really looks like. With gratitude, Barbara Wright. She read the email twice before hitting send. As soon as it disappeared from her screen, she exhaled deeply, as if releasing something heavy she'd carried for too long. Daniel watched her quietly, then gave her a small nod of approval. You did the right thing. Barbara leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange but welcome sense of peace. It's a start, she said. Daniel stood, picking up his briefcase. Well, I better head to my meeting. But Barbara... He hesitated, then smiled. I have a feeling this isn't the last time we'll cross paths. Barbara smiled back, warmth in her chest. I hope not. Daniel waved as he walked toward the terminal exit, disappearing into the sea of travelers. Barbara stayed seated for a while longer, watching the planes take off and land, reflecting on the flight that had changed everything. After a few minutes, she stood and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She walked toward the exit, her steps purposeful. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it with humility, with grace, and with the courage to listen. As she reached the automatic doors leading to the arrivals hall, she thought of Margaret Ellis's parting words. It's what you do after you rise. Barbara stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face, and smiled. She wasn't who she was yesterday, and that made all the difference. Barbara Wright stepped out of the terminal and into the crisp New York air. The city buzzed with its usual energy car horns, conversations, and the rhythmic hum of footsteps moving in every direction. Yet, amid the chaos, Barbara felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The weight of the past hours still clung to her, but something inside her had shifted like a compass needle that had finally aligned with true north. She pulled her phone from her bag and glanced at the notifications lighting up her screen. The video from the flight was spreading quickly. Comments flooded in, some harsh, some curious, but most of them praising Margaret Ellis. Words like grace, dignity, and leadership scrolled past Barbara's eyes. But every now and then, she saw another kind of comment. Can you believe the audacity of that woman? People like Barbara Wright are why we can't have progress. Barbara flinched but forced herself not to look away. She knew she had to face this, even if it stung. Her finger hovered over the app, and after a moment's hesitation, she opened it. The video played automatically, the familiar cabin scene unfolding. There she was, rigid, defensive, pointing fingers. And there was Margaret, composed and calm, answering accusations with measured grace. Watching herself felt like watching a stranger. Barbara pressed pause just as the camera caught Margaret's words. You've made assumptions about me that say more about you than they do about me. The truth of that statement hit her again, and she exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized how trapped she'd been by her own assumptions until Margaret held up that mirror. A notification interrupted her thoughts, an email response. Barbara's breath caught as she saw the name, Margaret Ellis. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Dear Barbara, thank you for your email. The fact that you chose to reflect, acknowledge, and reach out means more than you realize. Growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from moments of reckoning, like the one you experienced today. I hope you hold on to that discomfort and let it shape you into someone who builds bridges instead of walls. You've taken an important step. I believe you will take many more. Safe travels on your journey forward. With respect, Margaret Ellis. Barbara read the email twice, feeling the weight and encouragement behind every word. Her eyes stung, but she blinked back the tears. This was the affirmation she hadn't realized she needed, not praise, but an acknowledgement that change was possible if she chose it. Her phone buzzed again, a new message from her boss, Ellen Rivera. Barbara, I just saw the video. We need to talk. Barbara's stomach twisted. She had expected this. Ellen was direct but fair, and Barbara knew she wasn't about to get off easy. She took a deep breath and called Ellen. Barbara! Ellen's voice was calm but serious. I wasn't sure if you'd reach out so soon. Barbara cleared her throat. I figured it was better to face this head-on. There was a pause before Ellen replied. Good. Then let's be honest, this doesn't look good. Clients have already reached out. They want to know if this is the kind of behavior we condone. Barbara's heart sank, but she forced herself to stay steady. I know, she said quietly. And you're right. What I did was wrong. I let my assumptions and pride get in the way of respect and fairness. I'm not going to make excuses. I've already apologized to Dr. Ellis, and I'm working on how to make this right, not just in words, but in actions. There was silence on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavier than any lecture. Finally, Ellen spoke again. Barbara, she said, her voice softer, it takes courage to own up to something like this, but it can't end with an apology. The real question is, what are you going to do moving forward? Barbara nodded, even though Ellen couldn't see her. I want to rebuild trust with my team, our clients, and with myself. I know that's not going to happen overnight, but I'm ready to put in the work. Ellen's voice carried a note of approval. Then start now. Come in tomorrow, and we'll talk about next steps." Barbara exhaled, relief and determination settling over her. "Thank you, Ellen." "Don't thank me yet," Ellen said with a small chuckle. "You've got a long road ahead, but I believe you can walk it." As the call ended, Barbara stood still, letting the noise of the terminal fill the silence left behind. She took a moment to steady herself, then started walking toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the skyline. Barbara hailed a cab, her mind still buzzing with thoughts of what the future held. As the driver pulled away from the curb, Barbara glanced out the window, her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. She saw her own face, but thought of Margaret's of the steadiness and empathy in her eyes. Margaret had every reason to shut Barbara down, to humiliate her, but instead, she'd offered grace. Barbara leaned back in her seat and whispered to herself, "Be better. Not perfect. Just better." As the cab wound its way toward Midtown, she pulled out her phone again and opened the Notes app. She began typing, "Action Plan for Change." Her fingers flew over the screen as she listed ideas: joining diversity and inclusion workshops, mentoring new employees, and most importantly, learning how to listen before speaking. She smiled faintly. This list wasn't a box to check. It was a guide to becoming the person she knew she could be. The cab merged into traffic as Barbara's reflection in the window grew clearer. For the first time, she recognized the woman staring back at her, not as someone perfect or faultless, but as someone willing to grow. Barbara Wright stepped out of the cab onto the busy streets of New York. The late afternoon sunlight bounced off the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the bustling sidewalks. People hurried past her, some on their phones, some carrying coffee cups, all moving with the frenetic energy of the city. But Barbara stood still for a moment, letting the world move around her as she absorbed the magnitude of what lay ahead. She'd spent so much time running toward what she thought was success, only to realize that real success wasn't about winning arguments or proving herself. It was about learning, listening, and building something better, not just for herself, but for others. She took a deep breath and walked through the revolving doors of her office building, determined to begin again. The next morning, Barbara arrived early, her heels clicking softly against the quiet marble floors. The office was empty, except for a few early risers. Her assistant, Kelsey, looked up from her desk, surprise flickering across her face. "Barbara?" Kelsey blinked, glancing at the time. "You're here early." Barbara smiled faintly. "I have a lot to do." Kelsey hesitated, then asked carefully, "Are you okay?" Barbara paused, meeting Kelsey's eyes. She'd always been distant with her team professional to a fault, but now she realized how much that distance had cost her. "I will be," Barbara said honestly. "And Kelsey, thank you for asking." Kelsey's surprised smile was small but genuine. Barbara continued toward her office, pausing at the glass door before stepping inside. She sat at her desk and pulled up the agenda for the day's team meeting. Usually, these meetings were routine, a list of action items, a few status updates, but today, Barbara wanted to start differently. When her team gathered in the conference room an hour later, there was a quiet unease in the air. Everyone had seen the viral video. They were waiting to see how Barbara would address the elephant in the room or if she'd avoid it entirely. Barbara stood at the head of the table, her palms resting on the polished surface. She took a steadying breath and began. "I know you've all seen the video," she said, her voice clear but calm. "And I'm sure many of you have questions about what happened, about what I said, and about who I am as a leader." The room was silent, but Barbara could see the flicker of curiosity and caution in their eyes. "I want to be transparent with you," she continued. "I made a mistake, a big one. I let my assumptions dictate my actions, and I hurt someone in the process. I can't undo what I said on that plane, but I can tell you this. I'm committed to making real changes, not just in myself, but in how I lead and how we work as a team." A few heads nodded, though the room remained quiet. Barbara wasn't expecting applause or validation. She was here to take responsibility. "I've learned that leadership isn't about being right all the time," Barbara said. "It's about accountability, empathy, and making space for others. And I want this space, our team, to reflect those values." There was a long pause, and then Kelsey, who had quietly slipped into the back of the room, raised her hand. "Barbara, I appreciate you saying that. I think we all do." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A senior team member, David, spoke up next. "We've always respected your drive, Barbara," he said, "but hearing you admit that you're willing to grow, that's a kind of strength, too." Barbara smiled a real smile, not the guarded one she used when she was trying to maintain control. "Thank you, David." The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to something lighter. People began speaking more freely, sharing ideas about how they could foster a more inclusive and collaborative work environment. Barbara listened, taking notes, not as a formality, but as a genuine effort to absorb what they were saying. She could feel it, the first steps toward rebuilding trust. Later that day, Barbara sat alone in her office, reflecting on how much had changed in just 24 hours. She pulled up Margaret Ellis's email again and read the line that stuck with her the most. "Growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from moments of reckoning." She smiled softly. Margaret had been right. This wasn't going to be an easy road, but it was the right one. Her phone buzzed with a notification, another article about the viral video. Barbara hesitated before opening it, but when she did, she was surprised by the headline, "Grace in Leadership: How Margaret Ellis's Legacy Sparked a Movement." The article wasn't focused on Barbara's mistake. It was focused on Margaret's poise and the conversations it had inspired. The story was no longer about division or shame. It had become a lesson in resilience, dignity, and the power of change. Barbara leaned back in her chair, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She thought of Margaret's calm smile, of Daniel's encouragement, and of the passengers who had borne witness to a quiet transformation mid-flight. That evening, Barbara walked out of the office and into the golden glow of the setting sun. The city was alive with noise and movement, but for once, she didn't feel rushed or overwhelmed. She felt grounded. As she strolled down the sidewalk, she saw a group of teenagers laughing and pointing at something on their phones, probably another viral trend. Barbara smiled to herself and kept walking, letting their joy remind her that change, too, could be contagious. At the corner, she paused and pulled out her phone. She drafted a final note to herself. "Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being present, accountable, and kind. Every step counts." She saved the note and slipped her phone into her bag. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had learned how to rise, and now she was ready to build something stronger. As Barbara Wright's story reminds us, life is a journey of growth, humility, and the courage to change. Every mistake is an opportunity to rise, listen, and become better, not just for ourselves, but for the people around us. If you found inspiration in this story of resilience and transformation, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that uplift, challenge, and inspire. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, because the best journeys always begin with one small step. Thank you for watching, and remember, true strength is found in how we rise after we stumble. See you next time.